Hello, I'm Dr. Pierre Samaan, and it's wonderful being back with you once again. We've been talking about depression and the 4Ds of depression, those 4Ds that lead into depression. We've discussed difficulty, discouragement. We're in the process of talking about distress, and we're going to be getting into despair the next time. Hopefully, we'll get there. I was looking at these 4Ds and I was thinking, gosh, there is a process that seems to occur. And that difficulty, we all go through. We all have difficulties. Every day there's difficulties. And we've spoken about that difficulty is mild to moderate stress. And so stress is every day, and it's a good thing to a point because stress keeps us alert, keeps us on the edge of doing the best we can, and that's a good thing when we look at it that way. Discouragement, though, takes it that next step where moderate to severe stress activates an alarm reaction. That alarm reaction brings about this discouragement that, oh, something's wrong, something's amiss, we got to do something about it, and we have spoken about that. Well, we all get discouraged, don't we? But there's that point of discouragement where you're on the edge, and if it gets a little too much, then it dips over into distress. And distress is severe stress activating that stage of resistance. Now we're overcompensating when we're in distress. Like anything else, it's a continuum, mild to severe. Mild isn't so bad, is it? And you get into moderate distress, suddenly now you're overcompensating in an exaggerated way, a little too much. And when we do that, bad things happen. There's a pushback that occurs. There's things that we might do that create a problem on the other end. So we try to fix something, creating another problem, which creates another problem, and so on and so forth. So we've been talking about distress. We talked about part 1, part 2. Today we're going to talk about part 3 regarding distress. And then despair is uncontrolled stress, activating the stage of exhaustion where you just kind of burn out at that point. And that leads into depression for many people. And certainly, again, depression can be brief, it can be shallow, or it can be deep and long-term, hard to come out of, depending on your physiology, your makeup, your history, and so forth. When we talk about distress, we're talking about the defensive posturing that occurs. And you kind of think, why does that happen? What goes on there? And I was reading this morning a scripture, and I thought, I ought to deviate from the outline a little bit and look at this scripture. Before I do, let me mention that our brains are organized in certain ways, and we think in certain patterns. Some people, their thinking may be a little more different than other people, but there is a pattern that's talked about, and it's a binary pattern in which our thoughts are filed in a one or the other pattern in the brain, making it easy to access, or however the neuroscientists want to explain it away. Here is a neuroscientist explaining this, and Dr. Andrew Newberg, he's an MD and a neuroscientist. He also writes about neurotheology. And he says this: the brain has a propensity for setting up opposites as a way of understanding the world around us. The binary process helps us to distinguish good from bad, or right from wrong. Simple. Good, bad, right, wrong. Feel good, feel bad. Good thoughts, bad thoughts. It kind of sets it up that way. And that makes sense when you think about it. And so when we've been talking about the brain in the past and how it affects the way we think and so on, and we talk about the good thinking producing good proteins in the brain, which feeds the brain cells and nourishes and increases circuitry, and bad thinking, which is the fear and emotion center of the brain, which creates negative thinking, which ends up creating that weed killer protein we talked about that causes dark cells to be produced, and that stifles, smothers brain cells and circuitry, preventing them from thriving and growing, and so memories begin to be lost and so on. Right and wrong, good and bad. So when we think about this, I was looking at a scripture this morning, and let's see if I can find it here. Psalm 1, chapter 1, verses 1 to 2, goes into 3 just a little bit, but it's talking about, in my mind, as I'm reading it, it's talking about thinking right. And it says, blessed blessed is the man or woman who walks not in the counsel of the wicked. Now, we're a faith-based ministry, so we use Scripture as a help, a tool in understanding our lives, in knowing right from wrong, doing good things, and so on. But we learn from these things as well. Whether someone's religious or not, there are truths out there that teach us and help us. And here's a truth that's telling us that if we don't favor individuals that are bad thinking, negative thinking, we avoid them, we stay away from that type of thinking or person, well, we're going to be blessed. And blessed basically means fortunate, prosperous, favored by God. And no doubt God favors, others favor you as well. How many people are favored who are very negative or cynical or just downright ornery, perhaps caustic? You get a few people might favor them, but most people, they don't favor them. So here's a scripture that's based on some truth that we can look at and say, okay, well, that makes sense. It goes on to say, following their, is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, following their advice and example. Now, there are people out there who mean well, but because they're in distress, and that's why I'm talking about this, that level of distress being more moderate to severe for certain individuals, perhaps they went through a trauma, a death, a traumatic event, perhaps their business is failing, and they're going into this moderate to severe level of distress, and they're overcompensating to feel better or to avoid the discomfort, avoid the thoughts and so on. Well, what oftentimes tends to happen with them is they go too far in that overcompensating, and they look for things that are right for them, that feel good for them, even if it's not good for others. They try to convince others that they should believe the same thing or do the same thing, be the same way. And in doing that, they cause others to believe the way they're believing in their distress and their overcompensating, which tends to create more harm than good. And now others are being harmed because that person thinks, oh, that's bad, that's awful, it doesn't make me feel good, therefore if it's not making me feel good, it must be terrible. You should believe that way too, because that's awful. And so they try to convince you to believe that way as well. As an example, a businessman whose business is becoming damaged by competition or whatever, and he didn't listen to advice or make adjustments as he should have made, and now it's in a downward spiral, and he's in great distress, fearing the loss of these years of investment and years of hard work. And so he overcompensates by not listening. We're going to talk some more about that in a little bit. By not listening to the advice of others because it doesn't feel good. It doesn't fit his binary thinking. So he tries to convince everyone his way is the right way, and that's that. But in doing so, it may not be the right way, so he brings others into his camp of thinking, then they're having trouble too as a result, and they're going down with the ship, so to speak. The scripture goes on to say, nor stand in the path of sinners. Sinner, anybody who does things that are harmful, anyone who does things that are not good, that hurt themselves or hurt others, that's a sinner. It's easy, the word people don't like to use nowadays, but basically it's someone who's doing something that's going to hurt them or hurt others, one way or another. Nor sit down to rest in the seat of scoffers and ridiculers. In distress, you're going to see the scoffers and ridiculers. You're going to see those individuals that are mockers. You're going to see those individuals who are very negative and cynical. Now, some people kind of grow up sarcastic, and that's the way they communicate and all that. We're not talking about those individuals, but we're talking about those individuals who take that sarcasm to the extreme, and they mean what they say. They become scoffers and ridiculers, mockers, and as a result, everything is a negative. Everything is not good for them and not good for others as far as they're concerned. And they draw people in that way of thinking. Well, as we get to distress, we need to realize that working with that defensive posturing, we were talking about some of the examples of that, and now we're into blame shifting. How many of you know someone who shifts the blame whenever something is addressed that they don't want to hear, that they get overly defensive for? Immediately they turn it around and find something in you or something in someone else to shift the blame away from them. It's an unwillingness to accept responsibility. It's an overcompensation. It becomes an oppositional and overreactive attitude. And it's not uncommon to see distressed persons deliberately or unintentionally distress others. Defensive posturing is something we do at times, but these individuals are exaggerated in it. They go to a point that they can't see it, as we spoke about last time. They're in denial over it. And as far as they're concerned, they're right, you're wrong. And so they begin the spin attacks when approached with any issue. It could be a good issue, but they're so defensive, they end up putting a spin on it to either make you look bad, make others look bad, distracting you from themselves, launching blame as criticisms of others intensify. So in doing that, they're distracting. It weakens. It confuses others. And they know that. And if they're smart enough, they're good at it, it gets better and better. They do better and better at it. It helps them feel better about themselves, keeping others beneath them in one way or another. It builds an illusion of self-confidence by criticizing others. Whenever you hear someone criticizing someone else, we all do it a little once in a while, but we should try our best not to. Certainly it's not what we're taught to do biblically. It's not something that produces fruit, good fruit, as we would say spiritually. It's something that tends to produce negative fruit. In other words, when you criticize, criticism is going to come back at you. What you dish out is going to come back in one way or another. You try to make others appear powerless, ignorant, and harmful when you criticize. And so that defensive posturing brings about criticism back, one way or another. Well, manipulating others' mind games occur. You ever know someone who plays mind games, especially when they're in distress? When you see that, you can say, okay, this person's in distress of some sort, something's in conflict inside, and they're pushing away, they're hiding, they're protecting themselves. Why is that? What's going on? Twisting words of others to distract or confuse or discourage. Guilty conscience intensifies criticism and judging of others. So certainly when you hear that coming from someone else, do they have a guilty conscience? What's happening there? Are you doing it? And if you are, do you have a guilty conscience? Is there something bothering you that you need to address? These are all things that if we pay attention to, we can address them early, catch them, heal what needs healing, resolve what needs resolving to feel better, to do better, because we think better, we problem solve better. Here's a passage of scripture that says, don't judge and criticize and condemn others unfairly with an attitude of self-righteousness, superiority, as though assuming the office of a judge. So we don't want to judge anyone, so that you'll not be judged unfairly. What goes around comes around, it's saying. For just as you hypocritically judge others when you're sinful and unrepentant, so will you be judged. And in accordance with your standard of measure used to pass out judgment, judgment will be measured to you. Again, what goes around comes around. If you speak and do good things tend to come back to you. Others speak well of you, do good things on your behalf. It's not always, but actually most of the time it tends to happen that way. It goes on to say, why do you look at the insignificant speck that's in your brother's eye, but don't notice and acknowledge the egregious log that's in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me get the speck out of your eye, when there's a log in your own eye? You hypocrite, play actor, pretender. Yeah, people in distress that are overcompensating, a lot of people see them as pretenders, hypocrites, because others see they're not saying the right things, they're not doing the right things, but they can't see it themselves. They're in that denial state of sincere delusion that we spoke of previously. First, get the log out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. That's Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 to 5. Well, unpredictability to regain control is often what occurs. They get unpredictable. They need to regain that control. And so they keep others off balance by adding to the confusion, taking back power and control by saying no, being negative, going the other way when others are saying go this way. In doing so, they're in charge, they're in control. They feel safer because they're escaping whatever is bothering them, whatever the trouble is. Instead of facing it and working it out, they're escaping it with negativity. Wears them out. Each time you escape, instead of facing a distress, instead of facing a problem, it wears you out. You're having to think more, you're having to do more. The escaping feels good, it gives you that illusion of feeling better, but it creates more fear of abandonment, more fear of burnout, more fear of whatever, more insecure. One escape is not good enough. Now we need two. Now we need three. We need a backup. And before you know it, those backups bring us into a cycle that we unrelentingly see things one way, everyone else is seeing it another way. Well, when we remain in that stage of distress, we're remaining in an active reaction stage of stress. If distress continues, the cycle will repeat. After each event, that repeating cycle wears you down physiologically, wears your energy down, hope is dashed. What can you do? And after a while, exhaustion and burnout occur. And that leads into despair. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. We can put a stop to that along the way, facing truth. Sometimes facing truth, we need good thoughts. Because we're thinking so negatively in distress, we need to hear people that are thinking more positively. Good thoughts. Sometimes, let's say a businessman needs to listen to a successful businessman and what he's saying and doing about how he's achieved wherever he's come from and where he's at now. Well, hearing that, it gives hope. It gives a plan, a strategy. In Psalm 118, verses 5 to 6, it says, "Out of distress I called on the Lord. The Lord answered me and set me free." Well, what's he saying here? He's saying in his distress, he looked for truth, he looked for hope, he looked for something good to put back within his thinking to get out of that negativity, to get out of that distress of thought, to get out of that self-condemnation and whatever else is going on inside. The Lord is on my side, the scripture says. I'll not fear. What can man do to me? When we look to a source that is proven to be good, to be truth, to be helpful, to be uplifting, what does that do? It starts to feed the good thoughts in our mind. It starts to bring about those enzymes that produce the good proteins, that feed the brain cells, that help you to think more positively, problem solve better. Because when you're in that fear center, the limbic system and that fight or flight response, you're not problem solving very well. You're thinking doom and gloom, and you're trying to prevent doom and gloom, and you end up thinking more negatively. You end up not problem solving the situation very well. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. Okay, that's just telling us, don't panic. Pay attention, stand your ground, and trust in what has worked in the past, those things that you know are good, those things you know are reliable, dependable, those things that work. Sometimes it's like going back to the ABCs, those basic things that are true and that work. Well, in spiritual counseling or faith-based counseling, we look at those things that work, those things that in general benefit most people when they follow it, and we look at that and say, okay, how can we apply that to what's going on now? And we identify those things that are tearing us down, bring in place of it, replace it with those things that history has proven works. For when he has stood the test, he'll receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. James chapter 1, verse 12. When we do those things, we're standing, it's working, things do get better. Maybe not for all, for the majority. We can see in history things do get better for most people. Bad things happen to good people too. It rains on the good and the bad. But the good seem to get through it a whole lot better than those who are not paying attention to those good things and are staying in distress. Unchecked distress becomes exhausting and deteriorates into despair. We don't want to go there. Sometimes we do, and if we do, we want to get out of it as quickly as possible. So we'll be talking about despair the next time. Thanks for listening. I hope this was helpful for you. Give us a like, follow us on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter, and we'll do our best to keep you informed. God bless.